It's my great pleasure this afternoon. Afternoon her time, she's coming in from the East Coast, and we just passed the noon hour here in Mountain Time, to have Elke U joining us today. She is the Gerhard R. Andlinger Professor in Energy and the Environment and Professor of Psychology and Public Affairs at Princeton University. And I really love what she wrote about herself and her philosophy, and I'm going to quote this from her, which she's probably going to find awkward, is that she believes that the psychological theory needs to interfere with social problems in a two-way dialogue, providing itself with constructive solutions in real-world settings and being enriched and constrained by those settings. So much of her work draws on the distinctions between Homo sapiens and Homo economicus, also known as the economic man for those of you who are familiar with economic theory and philosophy. And she also examines individual, group, and cultural differences in risk-taking. She started 3 centers and labs to investigate human decision-making in its complexity, combining both theory and tools from cognitive psychology, behavioral economics, and the neurosciences. So when we talk about untangling complexity in a changing world, I don't think we have a better person here to help provide us some of her beautiful insights into how we're going to do that. So she's going to speak a little bit today about the human responses to the dual challenges of COVID-19 and the climate crisis, which is going to be a great endpoint on today's conversation and set us up very well for Thursday. So with that, let me turn this over to Dr. Weber. Thank you for joining us. How are you today?
Thank you, Kristan, for your very generous introduction. And let me see if I can share my screen. Here we go. Share. And I think we might be ready to roll.
Looks like it's coming up. Yep, you need to go back to your intro slide, but other than that, it looks good.
It's a little slow in responding. Here we go. All right. So what I want to talk to you about is human behavior with respect to energy consumption and the sources of energy that we use and the effect on the environment. And of course, we know that that behavior has given rise to increases in CO2 emissions and climate change. And in fact, we've called our time period the Anthropocene, the time period where human behavior is changing the environment. And the ruling assumption in the policy arena, in economics, about how we make decisions in this context is one of rationality. Kristan already mentioned Homo economicus, and the notion is that science that we generate gives rise to action. And if there's no action, there must be an information deficit. We just have to sort of produce more science, better science, or perhaps communicate it in different ways. I'm so sorry. For some reason, this web interface is not working very well. Just one second. So, okay, so back to making decisions and science and rational decisions. And what I want to argue is that we're really dealing with the wrong species. It's not Homo economicus, not the rational economic man and woman, but it's Homo sapiens, us, human beings, who make these decisions. And rationality, and as an outgrowth of rationality, of course, science is a huge evolutionary accomplishment. We certainly have evolved the hardware to be rational, but it turns out we have to program the software. We have to send our kids to college to figure out what probability theory means and what rational decision making means. What comes hardwired is really that we do things on a trial and error basis. We're really creatures of not so much of rational deliberation, but of habit. We learn best from personal experience. When it hurts, we stay away. When it feels good, we approach. Far better than from statistics. Oftentimes, we also use our associations, the residue of trial and error learning, the emotions that we associate with things, good and bad emotions, and also rules that we've evolved as a culture on what works in certain contexts to guide our actions, not just rational deliberation. So I want to talk a little bit about climate change, but also, since it's very topical, say something about COVID-19. And it turns out that these social issues are both wicked problems in the sense that there are no easy solutions for them. They're hard to process, but they also share certain characteristics. In both cases, the risk of negative consequences is an abstract statistical event. It's oftentimes in the future. When you don't wear your mask or you make contact with somebody who has COVID, you don't find out right away that that was a bad decision. It takes a week or two. And similarly with climate change, so we're going to find out in 5 or 10 or 50 years' time that our current behavior is not the best one. In terms of solutions, they require sustained attention on many fronts. And there's no silver bullet, no single action will get us there, but sustained attention sort of will win the day. So there's plenty of silver buckshot, but no simple solutions. On top of that, the costs of action are right now upfront. They're tangible, they're for sure. The benefits are uncertain. There's some probability we won't get COVID, even if we interact with a person who has it. They're disputed in the future, and those are all good reasons to discount the benefits, but to be very aware of the costs. And that, of course, is a recipe for the status quo, for not doing anything about these hazards. You could argue in many situations the status quo or business as usual actually is a conservative. It's a safe option. It's the devil we know. We realize what the consequences are. And deviating from that sort of might carry its own set of risks. But of course, that is exactly not the case for climate change and for COVID-19. Business as usual for climate change, continue to emitting CO2 is going to get us into huge trouble for our survival on this planet. And similarly with COVID-19, we currently are seeing the consequences of business as usual in many states. So I want to just provide us with some takeaways of what it means that we're communicating not with Homo economicus, with a rational, completely rational human being, Mr. Spock, but we're communicating with Homo sapiens. And what are those takeaways? So my first takeaway is that we want to utilize the full set of ways, of modes in which we make decisions. On the one hand, calculation-based decisions, but at the same time also emotion-based decisions. The kind of thing that's hardwired. We might remember nothing about a movie we saw 5 years ago, but remember whether we liked it or not. And on top of that, also rule and role-based decisions where a certain code of conduct, a moral code of conduct or standing operating procedure in a company sort of tells us what's the right way of going about this decision is. So let me show you a study we conducted a year or two ago in 2 countries. We asked consumers of electricity in the United States and also in Switzerland to make a decision between a standard power option that had a certain price per month and a green power option that was slightly more expensive, but clearly had sort of environmental benefits. And they got a lot of information about these 2 options. And by and large, as you can see in both countries, people like green power. That's actually true in the United States across the political spectrum. There's sort of no polarization on that. But when you break down afterwards, we asked them how they made that decision, to what extent they actually used rational calculation of costs and benefits, or more emotion-based decisions, or some sort of rule of conduct about what a concerned citizen ought to be doing. And we explained to them what these modes were, and people rated the extent to which they themselves had used that mode. You saw that those people who indicated that they were using rational deliberation a lot were much less likely to have chosen the green electricity, the green provider. But the people who made the decisions by emotions or by rules and social roles were more likely to make that decision. What are the implications of that? Well, we probably shouldn't be communicating information about different power options the way utilities currently do with lots of statistics and costs and benefits, but we should providing them at the same time images that prompt a more emotion-based decision based on pride, or more rule-based decision based on being good citizens to promote that particular mode, which in turn then seems to suggest more forward-looking decisions. Here's the second takeaway. This is actually the title of a book of Kasanstein, who was in the Obama administration. Make change simple or simpler. And so even when we try to target calculation-based decisions, getting people to sort of compute costs and benefits and think about risks and benefits, we should make it easier, and we can make it easier for them to stand that information. And in many situations, we actually can set wise defaults. We can sort of get them to choose that option or get the option that is in their own long-term interest, that is in the social interest, by making that the option that will apply unless they decide otherwise. They can opt out rather than opting into these choices. And a few years ago, I got together 13 behavioral scientists who work on how to motivate behavior and behavior change in the energy and in the environmental arena. And we sort of looked through literature, identified that there really are 4 objectives that seem to be what we're trying to achieve when we change behavior. The first one is get people's attention, because energy and environmental decisions are not typically high on people's sort of agenda. We're more concerned about our marriage and about our kids than about electricity. So how to get their attention, then how to engage their desire to contribute to a social good, because oftentimes environmental decisions require contribution to that. It's not necessarily just best for you. And then also how to facilitate accurate assessment of risks and benefits and make complex information more accessible. Let me just go back for a second here. And we can do this with a variety of tools. And so I already mentioned the proper default in there, but there are other ways in which we can sort of present information in simpler ways. So the third takeaway is to attract, getting the scarce attention, how to attract attention. And there, I think the important takeaway is positive messaging works so much better than fear or guilt. While negative emotions, fear might get people's attention up front because it's motivating to pay attention. If there's not a simple solution to make that negative risk go away, people will basically switch channels. And so you want to tell them that there's a threat, like in this letter by CEOs a couple of years ago, that climate change is a major threat, but then also tell them that a prosperous, inclusive, and low-carbon world is possible. So combine some statement about the danger with some positive messaging about that it can be overcome. Labels matter and metrics matter. Calling something a carbon tax is probably the kiss of death, and a carbon dividend works much better. Using a word like a carbon user fee also has connotations of polluter pays and fairness. And I just want to show you another study we did a few years ago, where we asked people to make a decision between an airline ticket that did not include a carbon user fee and one that did include a carbon user fee. We had 2 pages of text that explained what the fee was, why it was priced the way it was, and what the benefits, how it was going to be used. And the only difference between 2 groups of people, one half and the other half, was we called the user fee a carbon tax, and the other one it was called an offset. People made their decision. We asked them what went through their mind as they made this decision. Before they made the decision, then they typed that in. They made their decision, and then we asked them what demographics. And as you can see, when the user fee was called a carbon offset, those green bars, it didn't matter who people were across the spectrum, Democrats, Independents, Republicans. Something like 62% actually picked the inclusive ticket. They bought the carbon user fee. But when the user fee was called a carbon tax, it didn't matter to the Democrats. But for the Republicans, the uptake went down to 27%. So it made a huge difference. So it turns out that what people typed in, sort of the arguments that went through their mind, actually explained why there was this difference in choice. And that the explanation relates to something called query theory, which I introduced with my colleague Eric Johnson a few years ago. And query theory is very much a theory about how we deal with bounded rationality. This is a term that Herb Simon got the Nobel Prize in economics for a few years back. And it sort of relates to the fact that we don't have infinite processing capacity. We have finite attention, finite processing capacity. And the way to see that is in the image on the right. You can either sort of see the white candlestick. You can see the two children looking at each other. You can switch back and forth between these two reversible images, but you can't really see them both at the same time. And query theory holds, and actually shows, that the same holds when we make decisions. You know, that when you sort of think about, okay, should I buy the inclusive ticket or should I get the cheaper ticket without that user fee? It matters that you ask yourself these questions sequentially. What argues for option A? What argues for option B? And sort of whatever option generates a larger sort of set of arguments for it, that's the one you go with. But it turns out the first option that you consider has a sizable advantage, because as you think about what's good for the first option, you temporarily inhibit all arguments for the other option. But then as you turn to the other option or the other options, since they were just a split second previously inhibited, they have a harder time coming to the surface. So all other things being equal, the first option that you consider has a sizable advantage. And of course, you know, sort of that's why having an attractive label, a carbon offset, you know, that basically means you can travel without guilt, makes it much more likely that you will basically examine that option first. If something has a carbon tax label and you're the person who hates taxes, like Republicans, you will switch to the other option. You will basically switch away from it and consider the non-inclusive ticket first. So labels matter, metrics matter. It turns out that for many environmental decisions, there are a variety of reasons why you might want to choose the environmentally more advantageous option that has little to do with the environment itself. And so this is a label that the Environmental Protection Agency actually redesigned in 2012. For reasons that are not interesting here. They at the time were sort of concerned that miles per gallon was not the best way of showing fuel consumption, and so gallons per miles were better. But while they were at it, this was a committee decision. They thought, well, why don't we also add some consumption costs? How much does it cost you to drive this car relative to other cars? And provided a fuel economy in the smog rating. And this shows up better in my original slides. It didn't transfer very well, but you get the idea. There are basically 4 or 5 different reasons for picking one car or another car that have either to do with the environment or with financial constraints, trying to save money, or with performance on your car. It turns out that, you know, initially we thought this was a bad label because it was information overload, but it turns out that people actually pick that dimension that coincides with their values. If they're concerned with money, they look at these boxes. If they're concerned about the environment, they look at these boxes. And you can tell that by doing eye tracking movements to see what people are looking at. And these different reasons all result in the same choice, but again, by different processes and by different values. The last takeaway is that timing matters. If you try to get people to change their behavior, to change the products that they're using, to change the way they go about something, try to do that during a time when they're making changes already anyway. You know, when they're changing jobs, when they're moving, that's the time to get them, for example, to switch to green electricity when you're moving, because you have to contact your utility provider anyway. Or to use external mandates, you know, sort of when the company has a new requirement of disclosing a climate risk, carbon risk, that might be the time to also get them to do other things. Utilizing crisis to implement change, this idea of building back better, is definitely a good idea, as we're worried about changes in our environment because of extreme weather, because of forest fires, or because of COVID. So let's get back to COVID. I said a lot about climate change. And one thing I want to sort of say is that in both of these cases, we've seen a lot of political polarization. Of course, political polarization is bad because it sort of it goes against, you know, sort of the consensus that we oftentimes need to pass policy, to pass legislation, to do something about an issue. It turns out it's not this notion of truthiness, that we don't necessarily live in the same universe anymore, that we don't sort of acknowledge the same facts as facts. It's not something that is necessarily new. It's been around for a while. William James, who's a famous psychologist, the brother of Henry James, talked about truth as something that works for me or for you, philosophical pragmatism. At the time, he was talking about a belief in God, but as we've seen, sort of this truthiness or pragmatism has been applied to other things that might actually be sort of worse for society than just discrepancies in our belief in God. And so I've done a lot of work on the fact that we oftentimes make decisions from experience, that seeing is believing, that as you sort of actually see the physical consequences of climate change in terms of flooding in your front yard, or forest fires that you attribute to climate change, people actually change their mind about that being a hazard that is real and needs some action. But at the same time, there's also been a lot of work on believing is seeing, on the fact that our values, our ideology, our motivations actually drive our cognition and our perception. It's not that we're necessarily sort of distorting what is true, but that we don't see the world with the same eyes. That that our ideology colors how we see the world. And of course, that suggests that polarization sort of might actually get worse over time, because we no longer live in a universally shared reality, and instead, there's wishful perception at work. So when COVID-19 came on earlier this year, we actually got funding from the National Science Foundation to ask a representative sample of about 5,000 American residents every few months about their perceptions of these two hazards, and also about sort of their attributions, their interpretations about why things were happening, and their willingness to act on these two hazards. I'm going to show you about some of the main dependent measures in this talk, which is worry about climate change or COVID, and then also their reported negative personal experiences with COVID or climate change. In terms of COVID, we'll be finding that sort of friends or neighbors sort of either got sick or died, but also negative material consequences, losing their job, financial hardships, and with climate change, extreme weather events, forest fires, sort of the kind of extreme events that people in this country unfortunately have been exposed to quite a bit over the course of the year. And then we asked them for their willingness to shift their behaviors in different ways that would help mitigate both COVID and climate change. And first of all, to show you what these variables look like, this is worry about climate change in wave 1, which was in April, and in wave 2, which was in July and August. And as you can see, yes, you see the political polarization. Republicans, the red bars, are much less worried about climate change in both waves than the Democrats, the blue ones. And in fact, sort of a little bit more in the second wave than in the first wave, because all groups have experienced more extreme events that could be associated with climate change. And for COVID, again, you see the political polarization, Republicans being less worried about COVID in both waves. And in fact, you can sort of see it with your eyes a little bit. People are somewhat less worried about COVID in the second wave than in the first wave. We've gotten used to this new danger, and familiarity oftentimes breeds, sort of a reduction in fear. So here are some predictive variables that we measured for people's concern about climate change. One of them is political ideology as a continuous variable. We also asked them how important, or whether religion was important in their lives, yes or no. And then we asked them for a variety of explanations for either issue, for climate change or for COVID, either science-based explanations or conspiracy-based explanations, or in all cases, people could indicate that they didn't know what caused it. And as you can see here, this is a bubble graph where the circle shows you the size of the correlation, and blue correlations are positive, red correlations are negative. And you sort of see that political ideology, being liberal, made it more likely that people gave a science-based explanation for both climate change or for COVID, and less likely that they indicated that religion was an important part of their life. But also being liberal made it less likely that people give a conspiracy-based explanation for this phenomenon. So let's see what these variables predict for us. What do we see in terms of seeing as believing? So what I'm plotting here is concern about either COVID in blue or climate change in red. And on the x-axis, on the left-hand side, we have people who have reported fewer negative experiences with either COVID or with climate change. And on the right-hand side, people who have reported more personal experience, negative consequences, with either hazard. And as you can see, for both hazards, there's a strong positive correlation. The more personal experience you have had in the last little while, the more likely are you, the more worried are you about this issue. Yes. So yes, seeing indeed is believing when it comes to worry. And you see the same pattern, low negative experience, high negative experience, for people's willingness to permanently shift some behaviors that could actually make a difference for these hazards. And again, an equally steep rise, sort of for both climate change and for COVID. What's interesting, it's not on the graph, but for both of these cases, if you break it down by political ideology, Republicans versus Democrats, the Republicans, if anything, show a steeper slope, in part because their worry about climate change and COVID starts at a lower level. But even if you're a Republican, if you report seeing negative consequences, you're more likely to be worried and you're more likely actually to do something about it. So that would suggest that as these hazards become more serious and more people actually have personal experiences, political polarization might actually decrease, might get less. But unfortunately, that's not where the story ends. We also see evidence for believing is seeing. And for the effect of a belief in science, or on the next slide, in conspiracy theories, on the reporting of negative experiences. So for these 5,000 people, we know where they live. We have the zip code, and we know how frequent negative consequences of either COVID in terms of morbidity, mortality, economic consequences, or climate change, extreme weather events were in these zip codes. And so we can basically control for actual experience, and even controlling for these actual rates of negative experience, we find that a belief in science, a smaller degree of belief and a larger degree of belief in science, actually predicts how much negative experience you will report. So in other words, if you believe more in science, then both for COVID and for climate change, you will report more negative experiences, controlling for the actual level. And if you have a stronger belief in conspiracy theories, as opposed to a low degree of belief in conspiracy theories, a stronger belief in conspiracy theory will decrease the amount of negative experiences that you report on either issue, sort of as part of your recent experience. So believing also is seeing, and of course that doesn't bode well for political polarization to go away. So how do we deal then with complexity in our changing world? The title of this year's conference. Well, as it turns out, external physical and the social context that people live in interact with their internal cognitive and social processes in important ways. We really do no longer share the same reality, if we ever did, but even increasingly more so with the fact of being more selective in where we get our information. But on top of that, even sort of actual physical reality, like a climate extreme weather event, or reporting how many people in your neighborhood have gotten sick, is strongly influenced by sort of what your beliefs are about sort of science or conspiracy. Science is just one reigning belief system. I think something like 29% of our respondents in April indicated that they thought that COVID was actually intentionally created in a Chinese lab. 29% of Americans reported that. And so conspiracy theories are alive and well. I used to get upset when people talked about science as a belief system, when people said, well, you shouldn't say that you believe in climate change because it's an actual fact. But it's actually sort of not so true in this sort of complex world that we live in, that science is necessarily sort of verifiable by sort of personal observation. Many scientific facts these days, on climate change, on COVID, we have to take, sort of at face value. And if your face is with scientists, you will, but if your face is not with scientists, you won't. And then lastly, acknowledging the full range of human processes, the fact that sometimes we deliberate rationally, we weigh pros and cons, but other times we actually sort of make decisions based on emotions. If it feels good, we choose it, we go with it. If it's scary, we back off, we shy away from it. And the full range of goals, which we didn't really talk about, but they're not just material goals, they also have to do with social goals. And of course, that's why we oftentimes see this polarizations, because people are parts of communities and they want to get the approval of their peers and who have similar values. Sort of acknowledging this full range of processes and goals really has important real world implications. It allows us to understand better certain decisions, including the mechanisms of political polarization. But importantly, it also provides us with a much broader range of insights on ways to overcome the polarization and how to change people's behavior to more sustainable patterns. Because we can activate sort of different modes of decision making that are much more likely to lead to foresightful decisions than just rational deliberations, where oftentimes sort of prisoners' dilemmas and game theory tell us that defection, not cooperating with the public good, is the way to go. So let me finish by thanking you for your scarce attention and acknowledging sort of my many colleagues who contributed to this work, and also the National Science Foundation for their financial support. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Elke. That was a really great presentation, and I think really hit on a lot of other questions that we were talking about earlier in the day. So if I can just take a few more minutes of your time and ask you a few questions here before we wrap up the day and bring our president and CEO back onto the stage with us. But I'm curious if your research or any of your work has looked a little bit at the information fatigue and how that impacts people's capacity to care, and or the similar phenomena of the fact that, well, if people think that they do their part, but others won't, so it doesn't even matter that much. I'm wondering if you could speak to a little bit of that about people's engagement and that the feeling of the capacity to care. Yeah,
those are great questions. And sort of one of the reasons why we actually sort of looked at COVID and climate change in our panel together was to test this hypothesis that I had about a finite pool of worry. There's this notion that so you can only worry about so much at a time. And so therefore, sort of as a new hazard comes up like COVID, people might actually lose interest in climate change and might be sort of less willing to endorse sort of political proposals or sort of to change their own behavior sort of in ways that might mitigate climate change. And that fortunately did turn out not to be the case. There certainly is a finite case of action and active attention to one issue. So if you look, for example, at tweeting patterns, people have tweeted less about climate change since COVID came on board. There's only so much you can do. But when it comes to concern, if anything, increased concern about COVID has increased concern about climate change. There's almost like, since that you have a higher arousal level about sort of things in the world anyway, you are more concerned about other issues in the world as well. So one doesn't take away from the other. And you do want politicians to work on both. You might not be able to deal with everything at the same time, but you want others sort of to do that for you. Now, that's not to say that sort of we don't get tired worrying about things. And at the end of the day, or at the end of the week, sort of we're much less concerned or much less sort of willing, sort of to do things. So I think that is also true at a different level. And I think one of the things that makes people sort of stop caring about certain things is this feeling that there's nothing you can do about it. That you don't have agency. COVID and climate change have become so big that sort of a single individual can't do anything about it. And of course, that's not entirely true. Yeah, I mean, drops in the bucket, if you multiply them by 8 billion people, yeah, and by people doing something over and over a few hundred times a year, drops in the bucket become floods, they become oceans. But we have to figure out how to convince people and how to convey to people that personal action on these things can make a difference, and take away this feeling of being so overwhelmed with an issue that sort of, you don't have any more motivation to even try to do something about it.
Yeah, that's a wonderful point, Elke. I just want to ask you one more question to build on that, because it definitely hits home a little bit to some of the conversations we were having earlier today about civic engagement and the individual role outside of political hobbyism and how we can impact ourselves and our local communities. So, when we think about, you maybe take this to yourself personally or some of the research that you've seen, when people are feeling overwhelmed, right? Like, what is something that you would leave people with? Like, you just mentioned we were talking about the drop in the bucket and the flood. When people feel overwhelmed about all the complexity going on in the world, what's something you would like to leave them with to give them hope or inspiration?
Well, one thing I didn't say so much, but I very much believe in that we're social animals and we take comfort from being part of groups, of families, of community groups. And I think one thing that can make things less overwhelming is to realize that other people either feel the same way, but also that sort of a group sometimes can do things that an individual might not feel they can do themselves. So I think this appeal for local action, and for community engagement and doing things, sort of at your village level, or doing things within sort of with your colleagues, sort of in your school, or with the people in your company. I think that can be a source of great sort of strength and also greater agency, because sort of you realize that sort of when you combine forces, when you combine ideas, good things can happen. And your government might not always know what the right solutions are, but at a more political level, we've had these citizens' assemblies, sort of that started in Ireland actually to sort of debate abortion, but now have been used in the UK. And in Korea and in other countries, in Germany as well, to get citizens, to think about both adaptation responses, what to do about nuisance flooding in their communities, but also to plan, sort of how to do something about climate change without bankrupting, people at lower income levels. And I think sort of, again, keeping things local, and connecting to your community and talking to other people about something, I think is a very good recipe against this despair.
That's wonderful. I agree with that. I appreciate your time. I appreciate your perspective. That was a wonderful presentation. A lot of good ideas there that I have not heard before. So I always love learning something new, and in particular query theory. So hopefully lots of good takeaways for our audience members as well. I'm very grateful for you joining us. Thank you very much, Elke. We look forward to keeping in touch with you, and hopefully you have a great rest of your day. And if you get a chance to join us on Thursday, we're going to be talking all climate on Thursday too. So feel free to pop back in as a participant and join us back on Thursday. But thank you very much for your presentation today.
Thank you so much, Kristan. It was my pleasure to be with you. Bye-bye.
It was a great pleasure. Thank you.